They say that in every career, there's a moment that defines everything that comes after. A turning point where your path splits, and the choice you make determines whether you rise or fall. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday morning when I was told I was being transferred to the basement office. The news was delivered with barely concealed smiles, and by lunchtime, the entire company was laughing about it. They thought they were burying me. They had no idea they were actually setting the stage for my greatest triumph. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I'm 34 years old. This is the story of how a humiliating demotion became the foundation of my rise to becoming the most powerful person in my company, the gatekeeper through whom every single important document must pass. But to understand how I got there, you need to know where I started. I joined Meridian Financial Services 8 years ago as a compliance analyst. Meridian was a mid-sized investment firm with about 400 employees, managing assets for high-net-worth clients and small institutions. It wasn't Wall Street, but it was respectable, profitable, and growing. The company occupied 5 floors of a downtown office building, with the executive suite on the top floor and various departments spread across the others. Compliance was never the glamorous department. We weren't the ones making deals or bringing in clients. We were the people who made sure everything was done legally and ethically, who reviewed transactions for regulatory compliance, who maintained the documentation that kept the company out of trouble. It was detailed work, often tedious, but absolutely critical. A single compliance failure could result in millions in fines or even shut down the entire operation. I loved the work. I know that sounds strange to most people, but I genuinely enjoyed the puzzle of regulations, the satisfaction of catching potential problems before they became disasters, the feeling of being the guardrail that kept the company safe. I was good at it too. Within 3 years, I had been promoted to senior compliance analyst, and I had earned a reputation as someone who was thorough, knowledgeable, and uncompromising when it came to following the rules. That last quality, being uncompromising, is what eventually got me in trouble. The compliance department was run by a man named Gerald Hoffman. Gerald was in his early 60s, counting down the days to retirement, and he had a philosophy that could best be described as, "Don't rock the boat." He believed that compliance should be flexible, that we should work with the business units to find ways to say yes rather than constantly saying no. In theory, that sounds reasonable. In practice, it meant that Gerald would often overlook problems or approve questionable transactions if they came from the right people. I couldn't do that. When I saw something that violated regulations or company policy, I flagged it, regardless of who was involved or how much money was at stake. This didn't make me popular, especially not with the sales team, who saw me as an obstacle to closing deals. The head of sales was a man named Brad Cunningham. Brad was everything I wasn't: charismatic, confident, politically savvy, and completely focused on the bottom line. He had been with the company for 12 years and had built strong relationships with senior leadership, including our CEO, Thomas Whitmore. Brad brought in more revenue than anyone else in the company, and he knew it gave him power. Brad and I clashed regularly. He would push transactions that I believed violated securities regulations. I would refuse to approve them. He would escalate to Gerald, who would usually find some justification to override my objections. It was a frustrating dynamic, but I told myself I was doing my job, even if nobody appreciated it. Things came to a head about 9 months ago. Brad brought me a transaction involving one of his biggest clients, a real estate developer named Victor Castellano. The structure of the deal was complex, involving multiple entities and cross-border transfers that raised red flags for potential money laundering. The documentation was incomplete, and several aspects of the transaction didn't make economic sense, which is often a sign that something else is going on. I rejected the transaction and sent a detailed memo to Gerald explaining my concerns. I also, following proper procedure, filed a suspicious activity report with our internal audit team, as required by regulations when certain red flags appear. Brad was furious. He stormed into the compliance department and demanded to speak with Gerald. I could hear him through the walls, his voice raised in anger. 20 minutes later, Gerald called me into his office. "Elena, we need to talk about the Castellano transaction," he began, looking uncomfortable. "What about it?" I asked. The documentation doesn't support approval. There are clear indicators that require additional investigation. Brad has assured me that everything is legitimate, Gerald said. The client is just privacy-focused, which is why some of the structures are complex. This is a $15 million transaction, Elena. We can't afford to lose this business over excessive caution. It's not excessive caution, I replied firmly. It's doing our job. If we approve this and it turns out to be problematic, we're all liable. The company is liable. Gerald sighed. Sometimes, Elena, you need to understand that business requires taking calculated risks. Not everything is black and white. Compliance is black and white, I said. Either something meets the requirements or it doesn't. This doesn't. The conversation went nowhere. Gerald approved the transaction over my objection, documenting that he had reviewed my concerns and determined them to be unfounded. I was furious, but there was nothing I could do. I had followed procedure. I had raised the alarm. If something went wrong, at least I had a paper trail showing I had objected. What I didn't realize was that Brad had been working behind the scenes to get rid of me. He had complained to Thomas Whitmore that I was costing the company money, that I was inflexible and difficult to work with, that I was holding back the business with my overly conservative interpretations of regulations. Gerald, instead of defending me or defending the compliance function, had essentially agreed, probably because he was tired of the conflict and just wanted a peaceful final year before retirement. 2 weeks after the Castellano transaction was approved, I was called into a meeting with Gerald and Sandra Chen, the head of human resources. My stomach sank the moment I saw Sandra there. HR only attended these kinds of meetings when something serious was happening. Elena, thank you for coming, Gerald began in a tone that was trying too hard to sound friendly. We wanted to talk to you about a change in your role. A change? I asked cautiously. Sandra took over. The company is reorganizing the compliance function to create greater specialization. We're creating a new position focused specifically on documentation and record-keeping. Given your attention to detail and your thoroughness, we think you'd be perfect for it. It sounded like a promotion the way she described it, but I knew immediately that it wasn't. What would my title be? I asked. Compliance Documentation Specialist, Sandra said, consulting her notes. That was a lateral move at best. Possibly even a step down from Senior Compliance Analyst. And where would I be located? There was a pause. Gerald looked at the table. Sandra maintained her professional smile. We're setting up a dedicated documentation center in the lower level, Sandra said. It will be quiet, with fewer distractions, ideal for the kind of focused work this role requires. The lower level. The basement. They were moving me to the basement. I see, I said quietly. And if I don't want this new role? Sandra's smile tightened slightly. Elena, I think you'll find this is really the best opportunity for you at Meridian right now. The alternative would be that we might need to evaluate whether there's still a good fit between your working style and the company's needs. It was a threat wrapped in corporate language. Take the basement office or be fired. I felt humiliated, angry, and trapped. But I also needed this job. I had student loans, a mortgage, elderly parents I helped support. I couldn't afford to quit without another position lined up, and being fired would make it much harder to find a new job. When would this transition happen? I asked. We'd like to make it effective next Monday, Gerald said. That gives you the rest of this week to wrap up your current responsibilities and transition your active files to the rest of the team. The rest of the week. They weren't even giving me time to process this or look for alternatives. They wanted me out of the compliance department immediately. I left that meeting in a daze. Within an hour, word had spread throughout the company. I could feel people staring at me as I walked back to my desk. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked amused. Brad Cunningham walked past my cubicle with a satisfied smirk that made my blood boil. That evening, my colleague Lisa came by my apartment. She had been one of the few people in the office to express genuine sympathy. "This is such bullshit, Elena," she said, anger evident in her voice. "Everyone knows this is retaliation for you doing your job. Gerald is spineless, and Brad is a bully. What am I supposed to do?" I asked. "I can't afford to quit, and they've made it clear that if I don't take this position, they'll find a reason to fire me." "Can you go over Gerald's head? Talk to someone in senior leadership." I shook my head. "Brad has relationships with all of them. They think he walks on water because of the revenue he brings in. And Thomas Whitmore has made it clear that he sees compliance as a cost center that should stay out of the way of the business. So what are you going to do?" I thought about it for a long moment. "I'm going to take the basement office," I finally said. "But I'm going to use it. They want me focused on documentation? Fine. I'm going to document everything. Every transaction, every approval, every decision. I'm going to create the most comprehensive, meticulous, unassailable record-keeping system this company has ever seen." Lisa looked at me skeptically. "How is that going to help you?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But information is power. And if they're putting me in charge of all the documentation, then I'm going to make sure I know everything that happens in this company." The following Monday, I moved to the basement. The office they had set up for me was in a corner of the lower level, past the mailroom and the storage areas. It was a small room with concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, no windows, and the constant hum of the building's mechanical systems. It was clearly a storage room that had been hastily converted into an office space. As I carried boxes of my belongings down the stairs, I passed several colleagues. Some offered awkward expressions of sympathy. Others couldn't hide their amusement. I heard laughter echoing in the stairwell behind me. Someone made a joke about sending mail down to the dungeon. I set up my desk, unpacked my belongings, and looked around my new domain. It was depressing. But it was also private. Nobody would casually stop by to chat. Nobody would be looking over my shoulder. For the first time in my career at Meridian, I would be able to work without constant interruption or oversight. The role of compliance documentation specialist, as it turned out, was exactly what it sounded like. I was responsible for maintaining all compliance records, organizing transaction files, ensuring proper documentation of approvals and decisions, and creating reports for regulatory examinations. It was the kind of work that most compliance professionals found boring and tedious. But I didn't find it boring. Because as I dove into the documentation systems, I realized something important. I was now the central repository for everything that happened at Meridian Financial Services. Every transaction crossed my desk. Every approval came to me for filing. Every decision that had compliance implications ended up in my records. I started by creating a comprehensive database. The company's existing record-keeping was haphazard at best, with files scattered across multiple systems and formats. I built a new system that captured not just the basic information, but the context around every decision. Who requested what? Who approved it? What concerns were raised and how they were resolved? What documentation supported each transaction? I worked 12-hour days in that basement office, systematically organizing years of records. Nobody bothered me because nobody cared what I was doing. I was out of sight and out of mind, exactly as they wanted. What they didn't realize was that I was building something powerful. 3 months into my new role, I discovered something interesting while organizing historical files. There were patterns in the transactions that Brad Cunningham had pushed through over the past 2 years. Certain clients appeared repeatedly. Certain types of structures kept showing up. And in several cases, transactions that I had flagged as problematic had been approved by Gerald with minimal documentation. I created a separate, private database tracking these patterns. I wasn't sure yet what I was looking at, but my instincts told me something wasn't right. I remembered the Castellano transaction that had precipitated my demotion, and I pulled those files to review them more carefully. That's when I noticed something I had missed before. One of the entities involved in the Castellano transaction had been used in 3 previous deals, all brought in by Brad. The entity was registered in a jurisdiction known for banking secrecy, and in each case, the ultimate beneficial owner was obscured by layers of shell companies. Even more interesting, the entity had engaged in transactions with 2 other Meridian clients, creating a web of interconnected deals that looked increasingly suspicious. I spent a week tracing the connections, working late into the night in my basement office. I used every database and research tool I had access to, piecing together a picture that became more troubling the deeper I looked. The pattern suggested what's known as layering, a money laundering technique where illicit funds are moved through multiple transactions to obscure their origin. I documented everything I found and created a comprehensive report. Then I faced a dilemma. If I took this to Gerald, he would almost certainly bury it, just as he had overridden my concerns about the original Castellano transaction. If I went directly to senior leadership, I would be violating chain of command and would likely be fired for insubordination. But I had another option. As the compliance documentation specialist, I was responsible for preparing materials for regulatory examinations. Our next examination by the Securities and Exchange Commission was scheduled for 6 months away. I had the authority to organize files and prepare documentation for that examination. And there was nothing in my job description that said I couldn't be thorough in that preparation. I created a detailed summary of the questionable transactions and included it in the examination preparation files. I made sure every supporting document was properly organized and easily accessible. When the examiners arrived, they would have everything they needed to spot the patterns I had identified. But I didn't stop there. I also began to notice other issues as I organized the historical files. Gerald's pattern of overriding compliance objections wasn't limited to Brad's transactions. There were dozens of cases where concerns had been raised and then dismissed without proper documentation. There were approvals that appeared to violate company policy. There were gaps in required procedures. None of these issues, individually, were catastrophic. But collectively, they painted a picture of a compliance department that had become dysfunctional, more focused on enabling business than on ensuring proper controls. I documented all of it meticulously. Meanwhile, life in the basement continued. Most days, I saw fewer than 5 people. The mailroom staff would drop off deliveries. Occasionally someone from IT would come down to check on servers. Once a week, Gerald's assistant would bring down files that needed to be archived. Nobody ever asked what I was working on or how I spent my time. The isolation was hard at first. I'm naturally social, and I missed the casual interactions with colleagues, the feeling of being part of a team. But gradually, I came to appreciate the solitude. In the basement, I could focus completely on the work. I could think deeply about patterns and connections without interruption. I could build my systems without anyone questioning my methods or my priorities. Lisa would visit occasionally, sneaking down during her lunch break to check on me. She was one of the few people who still treated me like a colleague rather than an exile. "How are you holding up?" she asked during one visit, looking around at my increasingly organized office. The walls were covered with filing systems and documentation flowcharts I had created. "I'm actually okay," I said, and I meant it. They meant to bury me down here, but I'm building something. Building what? A comprehensive record of everything this company does. Knowledge is power, Lisa. And right now, I probably know more about Meridian's operations than anyone else in the company. She looked at me with a mixture of concern and admiration. "Elena, be careful. If Brad or Gerald realize you're digging into things, they'll find a way to get rid of you completely." "They won't realize," I assured her. "As far as they're concerned, I'm just a file clerk tucked away in the basement where I can't cause any trouble. They've completely forgotten about me." And that was true. In the 4 months since my transfer, Gerald had visited my office exactly once, and that was only to retrieve a file he needed urgently. Brad never came down at all. I received occasional emails with instructions about filing or documentation needs, but otherwise, I was completely off everyone's radar, which gave me the freedom to keep digging. I expanded my private database to include not just transactions, but personnel decisions, correspondence between departments, and approvals of policy exceptions. I created network maps showing relationships between clients, identifying patterns and connections that weren't obvious from individual transactions. I built timelines showing how certain types of deals had evolved over the years. What emerged was a troubling picture. Brad Cunningham had built what essentially amounted to a parallel compliance process. For his biggest clients, he had established a pattern of bringing transactions directly to Gerald, often with incomplete documentation, and pressuring for quick approvals. Gerald, either out of weakness or willful blindness, had consistently approved these transactions despite clear red flags. The more I discovered, the more convinced I became that my demotion hadn't been random retaliation. Brad had needed me out of the way because I was the one person in compliance who wouldn't go along with his shortcuts and questionable deals. My transfer to the basement had been strategic, removing the obstacle to his operations. But in removing that obstacle, they had inadvertently given me something more valuable: time, privacy, and access to comprehensive documentation. In the basement, I could see patterns that would have been invisible from my previous position, where I was focused on individual transactions rather than the big picture. 6 months after my transfer, I received notice that the SEC examination would begin in 2 weeks. I spent those 2 weeks finalizing my documentation, making sure everything was organized and easily accessible. I created a comprehensive index of files, with special attention to the patterns I had identified in Brad's transactions. On the first day of the examination, 3 SEC examiners arrived. They set up in a conference room on the 3rd floor and requested various files and documents. As the compliance documentation specialist, I was responsible for providing these materials. I delivered exactly what they asked for, no more and no less. But I had organized the files in a way that made certain patterns obvious to anyone who looked carefully. I had created cross-references and indexes that would naturally lead an investigator from one questionable transaction to related ones. I had documented the chain of approvals showing how concerns had been raised and overridden. The examination was supposed to last 1 week. It lasted 3. As the examiners dug deeper, they kept requesting additional files, more documentation, expanded explanations. I provided everything they asked for promptly and professionally. Gerald began to look increasingly stressed. Brad became noticeably absent from the office, claiming to be traveling to meet with clients. In the 3rd week, I was called to meet with the lead examiner, a woman named Margaret Sullivan. She sat across from me in the conference room with hundreds of files spread across the table. "Ms. Rodriguez, I need to ask you some questions about the organization of these files," she began. "Of course," I said calmly. "The documentation you've provided is extraordinarily thorough, more comprehensive than what we typically see from firms of this size. Can you tell me about your system?" I explained the database I had built, the cross-referencing system, the documentation protocols I had established. Margaret listened carefully, making notes. "I noticed that you've flagged certain transactions with special codes in your index system," she said. "What do these codes represent?" "Those indicate transactions where compliance concerns were raised and subsequently overridden by management approval," I explained. "I created that coding system to track the decision-making process for regulatory examination purposes." "I see," Margaret said. "And these cross-references linking certain clients and entities together, was that also part of your standard documentation procedure?" "Yes," I said. "I believe that comprehensive documentation should show not just individual transactions, but relationships and patterns that might be relevant for understanding the full context of the firm's activities." Margaret looked at me for a long moment. "Ms. Rodriguez, how long have you been in your current position?" 6 months. "And before that?" "I was a senior compliance analyst." "Why were you moved to this documentation role?" I considered how to answer. I was told that the company wanted greater specialization in the compliance function. "I see," Margaret said, in a tone that suggested she saw quite a bit more than what I had said. "Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Rodriguez. The quality of your documentation has been extremely helpful to our examination." The examiners left after 3 weeks. We wouldn't know the results of their examination for several months, but the atmosphere in the office had changed dramatically. Gerald looked like he had aged 10 years. Brad was uncharacteristically quiet and spent most of his time behind closed doors. Senior leadership was holding urgent meetings. And then, 6 weeks after the examination ended, everything exploded. The SEC issued a preliminary findings report identifying serious deficiencies in Meridian's compliance program. They had found evidence of inadequate transaction monitoring, insufficient documentation of approval decisions, and failure to properly investigate suspicious activity. They had identified multiple transactions that appeared to violate banking secrecy laws and anti-money laundering regulations. And they had specifically noted that several of these problematic transactions involved clients brought in by the head of sales. The report didn't name Brad Cunningham specifically, but everyone in the company knew who it was referring to. More ominously, the SEC had referred certain findings to the Department of Justice for potential criminal investigation. Thomas Whitmore, the CEO, immediately hired an outside law firm to conduct an internal investigation. Gerald was placed on administrative leave. Brad's transactions were frozen pending review. And the company's stock price dropped 15% in 2 days. I continued to work in my basement office, waiting for what would come next. 3 weeks after the SEC report, I was summoned to meet with the outside investigators. They questioned me for 4 hours about my documentation systems, about specific transactions, about the compliance approval process. I answered every question honestly and provided detailed documentation to support my responses. The lead investigator, a former prosecutor named Robert Chin, seemed particularly interested in the private database I had created tracking Brad's transactions. "Ms. Rodriguez, why did you create this separate tracking system?" he asked. "I noticed patterns that concerned me," I said. As the documentation specialist, I felt it was my responsibility to organize information in a way that would be useful for regulatory oversight. "Did you report these concerns to anyone?" "I raised concerns about specific transactions before I was transferred to my current role," I explained. "Those concerns were overridden by my supervisor. In my current role, I don't have approval authority, so I focused on ensuring proper documentation for examination purposes." Robert nodded slowly. "Your documentation has been incredibly valuable to our investigation. The thoroughness and clarity of your records has allowed us to reconstruct decision-making processes that might otherwise have been obscured." Over the next 2 months, the investigation expanded. More problematic transactions were identified. The patterns I had documented turned out to be even more extensive than I had realized. Several of Brad's major clients were found to have connections to criminal enterprises. The Castellano transaction that had started my downfall turned out to be part of a money laundering scheme. Gerald was fired. Brad was fired and subsequently indicted on charges related to conspiracy to commit money laundering. 2 other members of the sales team were also terminated. Thomas Whitmore survived but faced intense scrutiny from the board of directors. Through all of this, I remained in my basement office, continuing my documentation work. Nobody seemed to know what to do with me. I was the person who had provided the evidence that brought down senior members of the company, but I was still technically just a documentation specialist. Until one day, about 3 months after Brad's indictment, when I received an email from Thomas Whitmore's assistant asking me to come to the executive suite for a meeting. I took the elevator to the top floor for the first time in 9 months. The executive suite was everything my basement office wasn't. Floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive furniture, artwork on the walls. Thomas Whitmore's corner office overlooked the city, with a view that must have cost more in rent than my entire yearly salary. Thomas stood when I entered, which surprised me. He gestured to a chair at his conference table. "Ms. Rodriguez, thank you for coming," he began. "I wanted to speak with you personally about your future with this company." I sat down, unsure what to expect. "First, I want to apologize," he continued. "You were right about the Castellano transaction. You were right about the deficiencies in our compliance program. And instead of listening to you, we punished you for doing your job. That was wrong, and I take responsibility for that failure of leadership." It was the last thing I had expected to hear from him. Thomas Whitmore had a reputation for being proud and not admitting mistakes. "The board of directors has asked me to rebuild our compliance program from the ground up," he continued. "We need someone who understands regulations, who has integrity, and who won't be influenced by pressure from the business side. We need someone who will tell us no when no is the right answer, even if it costs us revenue in the short term." He paused and looked directly at me. "We want to offer you the position of Chief Compliance Officer. You would report directly to me and have authority over all compliance functions, with the power to stop any transaction you believe violates regulations or company policy. No overrides, no exceptions unless you approve them." I was stunned. Chief Compliance Officer was a C-suite position, several levels above where I had been before my demotion. "I realize this is a significant change from your current role," Thomas continued. "And I understand if you have reservations about staying with a company that treated you so poorly. But I hope you'll consider it. We need you, Ms. Rodriguez. And more than that, you've earned this opportunity." I took a moment to collect my thoughts. 9 months ago, I had been humiliated, demoted, exiled to a basement office while people laughed about my downfall. Now I was being offered the most powerful compliance position in the company. "I have some conditions," I said finally. Thomas nodded. "Name them." "First, I want complete independence for the compliance department. No business unit can override compliance decisions without my approval. Second, I want adequate staffing and resources. Third, I want a seat on the executive committee, with equal standing to the heads of all business units. And fourth, I want a written policy that any retaliation against compliance staff for doing their jobs will result in immediate termination." "Done," Thomas said without hesitation. "All of it. The board has authorized me to give you whatever you need to build a compliance program that will restore confidence in this company." "Then I accept," I said. 2 weeks later, I moved from the basement to an office on the executive floor. It wasn't quite as large as Thomas's corner office, but it had windows, natural light, and a door that closed. More importantly, it had proximity to power. I was now part of every major decision the company made. My first action as Chief Compliance Officer was to hire a strong team. I brought in experienced compliance professionals from other firms, people who understood that their job was to protect the company by ensuring it operated legally and ethically, not to enable questionable deals. I also promoted Lisa to Senior Compliance Manager. She had stood by me during my exile, and I wanted people around me who had integrity. My second action was to implement the comprehensive documentation and monitoring systems I had developed in the basement. Every transaction would now be tracked through a centralized database. Every approval would be documented with clear reasoning. Every concern raised by any compliance staff member would be formally recorded and addressed. But most importantly, I implemented a new policy. Nothing moved forward without my signature. Every significant transaction, every new client relationship, every material policy exception had to cross my desk for final approval. I became the gatekeeper. The business units hated it at first. They were accustomed to operating with minimal oversight, to getting quick approvals, to having compliance be a rubber stamp rather than a genuine control function. Now every deal was scrutinized. Documentation requirements were enforced. Questionable transactions were rejected, regardless of how much revenue they represented. There was pushback, of course. Some sales staff complained that the new compliance requirements were making it impossible to compete. Some threatened to leave. Thomas backed me completely, making it clear to everyone in the company that compliance authority was absolute and non-negotiable. Gradually, the culture shifted. People realized that I wasn't trying to prevent business. I was trying to ensure that business was done properly. The deals that passed through my approval process were solid, defensible, and unlikely to blow up into regulatory problems later. Clients came to appreciate that Meridian was serious about compliance, which actually became a competitive advantage in an industry where trust is everything. 6 months into my tenure as CCO, I was reviewing transaction files when I came across a new client proposal. The structure looked familiar, and when I dug deeper, I realized it was being brought in by one of the former members of Brad's sales team who had survived the purge. The deal had red flags similar to the ones I had seen in Brad's questionable transactions. I rejected it immediately and called the salesperson into my office. "This transaction isn't going to be approved," I told him directly. "But I've structured it to meet all the documentation requirements," he protested. "Everything you asked for is there. The documentation is there," I agreed. "But the underlying transaction doesn't make economic sense, which suggests the real purpose is something other than what's being stated. That's a classic indicator of potential money laundering." "You're being overly cautious," he argued. "This is a legitimate client with a legitimate need. Then the client can structure the transaction in a way that's clearly legitimate," I said. "As it stands, I'm not signing off on this. And I'm also going to be reviewing all your other recent transactions to see if there are similar patterns." He left my office angry, and an hour later, I got a call from Thomas. "Elena, I just got a complaint that you're being too aggressive in rejecting transactions," he said. "I rejected one transaction that raised money laundering concerns," I explained. "The same type of concerns that got us into trouble before." There was a pause. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to back me up," I said. "People are going to test the limits of compliance authority. If they sense any wavering, we'll be right back where we started." "You have my complete support," Thomas said firmly. "Anyone who doesn't like it can leave." That conversation, more than anything else, established my authority. Word spread quickly through the company. Compliance meant what it said, and the CEO would support compliance over revenue. The testing stopped. People started bringing me concerns early in the deal process, rather than trying to slip questionable transactions through. The culture was changing. A year after my promotion to CCO, Meridian underwent another SEC examination. This time, the examiners found a well-functioning compliance program with proper controls, thorough documentation, and clear evidence that compliance concerns were taken seriously. The contrast with the previous examination was stark. We received commendations for the improvements we had made. The board of directors was thrilled. Our reputation in the industry improved. Clients trusted us more. And somewhat surprisingly, revenue actually increased. It turned out that doing business properly, with strong compliance controls, was actually good for business in the long term. We attracted better clients, avoided the costs of regulatory problems, and built a reputation for integrity that became a competitive advantage. I thought about that first day in the basement office often. How humiliated I had felt. How certain I had been that my career at Meridian was over. How people had laughed at my demotion, seeing it as evidence of my failure rather than their dysfunction. If someone had told me then that I would end up as Chief Compliance Officer, the gatekeeper through whom every important file in the company had to pass, I wouldn't have believed them. But that's exactly what happened. Not despite my time in the basement, but in many ways because of it. The basement exile had given me something invaluable: perspective, time, and access to comprehensive information. In that basement office, I had been able to see patterns that would have been invisible from any other vantage point. I had been able to build systems without interference. I had been able to document problems without political pressure. The very isolation that was meant to destroy my career had actually positioned me to save the company from itself. There's a certain irony in that. Brad and Gerald had thought they were burying me in the basement, removing me from any position where I could influence the company. Instead, they had given me the perfect platform to see everything, to understand everything, and ultimately to build the case that would bring them down and elevate me to a position of greater power than I had ever imagined. I learned some important lessons during that period. First, what looks like failure might actually be an opportunity in disguise. My demotion felt catastrophic at the time, but it gave me the space and freedom to do work that ultimately proved invaluable. Second, thoroughness and integrity matter more than politics in the long run. Brad was politically skilled and well-connected, but when his deals fell apart, all those relationships couldn't save him. Third, information really is power, especially when you're the only person who has comprehensive information about how everything connects. But perhaps the most important lesson was about patience and persistence. I could have quit after being demoted. I could have become bitter and done the minimum required in my basement role. Instead, I chose to use the situation to become indispensable. I built systems, documented everything, and positioned myself to be the person with the answers when questions were finally asked. Today, when I walk through Meridian's offices, people treat me very differently than they did during my basement exile. Instead of laughing or looking away, they're respectful, sometimes even nervous. They know that their deals, their transactions, their business plans all have to pass through my office for approval. They know that I'm not afraid to say no, that I won't be pressured or bullied, that I'll shut down any transaction that doesn't meet proper standards. My signature appears on every significant document that moves through Meridian Financial Services. Nothing happens without my approval. The woman they exiled to the basement, the one they thought they had buried and forgotten, became the most powerful gatekeeper in the company. I still have my old basement office. I've kept it as a storage room for archived files, but occasionally I go down there, sit at the old desk, and remember what it felt like to be exiled, dismissed, laughed at. It keeps me grounded. It reminds me that power is temporary, that circumstances can change quickly, and that the measure of a person isn't where they sit in the organizational chart, but how they respond when they're knocked down. Lisa visits my executive office regularly now. We have lunch together at least once a week, and she often jokes about our basement visits during my exile. Last month, over coffee, she said something that stuck with me. "You know, Elena, I've been thinking about something," she began. "When you were sent down to the basement, I felt so bad for you. I thought it was the end of your career here. But looking back, I wonder if it was actually the best thing that could have happened to you." "How do you figure that?" I asked, curious about her perspective. Because if you had stayed a senior compliance analyst, you would have kept fighting the same battles with Gerald and Brad, and eventually they would have found a way to push you out completely. But by putting you in the basement, they underestimated you. They thought they had neutralized you, so they stopped paying attention. And that gave you the freedom to build something they never saw coming. She was right. If I had remained in my previous position, I would have been constantly monitored, constantly pressured, constantly fighting for every small victory. In the basement, I had been invisible, which gave me power they never anticipated. Plus, Lisa continued with a smile, if you hadn't been in the basement organizing all those files, we might never have caught Brad's schemes. Your documentation was what made the case. The SEC examiner told me that without your cross-references and pattern tracking, they might have looked at individual transactions and missed the bigger picture. That was true as well. The comprehensiveness of my documentation had been the key to unraveling everything. And I could only have created that documentation because I had been given responsibility for all the company's records and enough isolation to organize them properly. So you're saying my demotion was actually a promotion in disguise? I asked with a hint of irony. I'm saying that sometimes the universe puts you exactly where you need to be, even if it doesn't feel that way at the time, Lisa replied. You made the most of a terrible situation. That's what separates people who succeed from people who just survive. Her words stayed with me. I had made the most of a terrible situation, but it hadn't been easy. There had been days in that basement office when I felt forgotten, when I questioned whether anyone would ever recognize my contributions, when I wondered if I should just update my resume and leave. The isolation had been difficult. The humiliation had stung. The knowledge that people were laughing at my downfall had been painful. But I had chosen to respond with excellence rather than bitterness. I had chosen to build rather than complain. I had chosen to document truth rather than ignore problems because fighting them seemed futile. Those choices, made day after day in a lonely basement office, had ultimately changed the trajectory of my entire career. Not everyone who gets demoted or sidelined will have the opportunity one had. Not every organization has the leadership or governance structure that ultimately allowed truth to prevail. I was lucky that the SEC examination happened when it did, Lucky that Thomas Whitmore proved willing to make difficult changes. Lucky that the board of directors prioritized long-term institutional health over short-term revenue protection. But luck only matters if you're positioned to take advantage of it. If I hadn't been meticulously documenting everything, if I hadn't been building comprehensive systems, if I hadn't been doing excellent work even when no one was watching, then even the SEC examination might not have revealed the full extent of the problems. My preparation was what made the difference between being a victim of circumstance and being the person who helped save the company from disaster. 2 years into my role as Chief Compliance Officer, we hired a new senior compliance analyst. Her name was Jennifer Park, and she reminded me of myself 8 years earlier. Smart, principled, perhaps a bit too idealistic about how the business world worked. During her first week, I took her on a tour of the office, including a stop in the basement. "This is our document archive," I explained, showing her the room that had once been my office. "It's also where I worked for 6 months when I was the compliance documentation specialist." Jennifer looked surprised. "You worked down here? Before you were CCO?" "I was transferred here after I refused to approve a transaction that the head of sales wanted," I said. "It was meant to get me out of the way, to bury me where I couldn't cause any more trouble." "What did you do?" she asked. "I used the time and the access to build the most comprehensive documentation system the company had ever seen. And when the regulators came, that documentation revealed patterns that ultimately led to criminal charges against the head of sales and a complete overhaul of our compliance program." Jennifer looked at the small room with new eyes. "So this basement office was actually where you built your career?" "In a way, yes," I acknowledged. "It didn't feel that way at the time. It felt like the end. But it turned out to be a beginning." I shared this story with Jennifer, and with every new compliance professional I hired, because I wanted them to understand something important. Doing the right thing isn't always rewarded immediately. Sometimes you'll be punished for having integrity. Sometimes you'll be sidelined for refusing to compromise on principles. But if you continue to do excellent work, if you build skills and systems and knowledge, if you document truth even when it's inconvenient, eventually that will matter. I also wanted them to know that I would protect them in ways that Gerald had never protected me. If they raised legitimate compliance concerns, I would back them up. If they said no to a transaction for good reasons, I would support that decision. They wouldn't be exiled to the basement for doing their jobs. I had learned from Gerald's failures, and I was determined to be a different kind of leader. The culture change at Meridian wasn't instantaneous or easy. There were people who left because they couldn't adapt to the new expectations. There were deals we lost because we wouldn't cut corners. There were moments when the business side pushed back hard against compliance requirements, arguing that we were being too rigid, too conservative, too focused on risk avoidance at the expense of opportunity. But Thomas Whitmore held firm, and over time, the results spoke for themselves. We had no regulatory violations in my tenure as CCO. We had no scandals. We had no front-page stories about illegal activity or ethical lapses. Our reputation improved. Our client retention improved. Our employee morale improved. It turned out that running a business with integrity was actually good business. 3 years after my promotion to CCO, I was invited to speak at an industry conference about building effective compliance programs. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of compliance professionals, I thought about how far I had come from that basement office. During the Q&A session, someone asked me about dealing with resistance from business units who see compliance as an obstacle. "The key is to remember that compliance and business aren't adversaries," I said. "We're all working toward the same goal: building a sustainable, successful company. Compliance protects the business by preventing problems that could destroy value far more than any single transaction could create it. When business leaders understand that, when they see compliance as a partner rather than an opponent, that's when you can build something really effective." Another person asked how to handle situations where senior leaders override compliance decisions. "Document everything," I said firmly. "If you raise a concern and it's overridden, document exactly what you recommended, why you recommended it, and what the decision was. That documentation might be what saves the company, and you, when problems eventually surface. In my case, the comprehensive documentation I maintained was what revealed patterns that might otherwise have stayed hidden. I didn't tell them the full story of my basement exile. That felt too personal, too specific to my situation. But I hoped they understood the underlying message. Your value isn't determined by your title or your office location. It's determined by the quality and integrity of your work. And sometimes, being pushed aside gives you the perspective and freedom to see things that are invisible to everyone else. After the conference, several compliance professionals approached me privately. They shared their own stories of being pressured to approve questionable transactions, of being punished for raising concerns, of feeling like they had to choose between their principles and their careers. I listened to each story with empathy, remembering how isolated I had felt during my own struggles. The most important thing, I told them, is to document your concerns and make sure you're doing your job with integrity, regardless of the pressure. You can't control whether leadership will listen to you, but you can control whether you're acting ethically and professionally. Sometimes that's all you can do. And sometimes, that ends up being enough. Not all of them found that answer satisfying. Some were looking for a guaranteed formula for success, a way to do the right thing without risk or sacrifice. I couldn't give them that. The truth is that standing up for principles sometimes comes with costs. I had paid those costs during my basement exile. Others might pay different costs in different situations. But the alternative, compromising your integrity to avoid conflict, comes with its own costs that compound over time. Back at Meridian, my authority as CCO was now well established, but I was careful not to abuse it. Power had corrupted Brad Cunningham, making him believe he was above the rules. I was determined not to let it corrupt me. I implemented checks on my own authority, creating appeal processes and requiring myself to document the reasoning behind significant decisions. I sought input from my team and from external advisors. I tried to be transparent about my decision-making process. I also made it a point to stay connected to the actual work of compliance, not just the strategic oversight. I still reviewed transaction files personally. I still talked to analysts about their concerns. I still spent time understanding the details of complex deals. That hands-on engagement helped me avoid the trap that Gerald had fallen into, becoming so removed from the actual work that he lost touch with the realities of what the company was doing. One afternoon, about 4 years into my tenure as CCO, I was reviewing a new client proposal when something caught my eye. The proposed transaction structure was complex but appeared legitimate. The client had been properly vetted. The documentation was complete. But something about it nagged at me. I spent several hours digging into the details, pulling historical files, checking cross-references in our database. Eventually, I found what was bothering me. One of the entities involved in the transaction had appeared in our files years earlier, in one of Brad's questionable deals. The entity had been dormant since then, but now it was being revived in a new transaction. I called in the analyst who had prepared the file, a young woman named Sarah who had been with us for about a year. "Sarah, tell me about this entity here," I said, pointing to the corporate structure diagram. "How did the client explain why they're using this particular vehicle?" "They said it was an existing entity that was convenient to use rather than setting up something new," Sarah explained. "The documentation showed it had been properly established and registered." "But did you look at what this entity was used for previously?" I asked. Sarah looked uncertain. "No, I just verified it was a legitimate entity. Should I have looked at its history?" "Yes," I said, not unkindly. "This entity was involved in a transaction several years ago that turned out to be part of a money laundering scheme. That doesn't automatically mean this new transaction is problematic, but it's absolutely a red flag that requires additional investigation. We need to understand why the client is choosing to use an entity with this history." Sarah looked mortified. "I'm so sorry. I should have caught that. This is a learning opportunity," I told her. "One of the most important things in compliance is understanding patterns and history. That's why we maintain comprehensive documentation going back years. Every entity, every client, Every structure has a history, and that history matters. We spent the next week investigating the new transaction more thoroughly. Eventually, we determined that the client's use of that particular entity was innocent. They had acquired it as part of a corporate restructuring and genuinely weren't aware of its problematic history. We approved the transaction after requiring them to use a different entity with a clean history. But the incident reminded me of why my documentation work in the basement had been so important. If we hadn't maintained detailed historical records, if we hadn't built systems that tracked entities and relationships across time, Sarah would have had no way to identify the red flag. The institutional memory I had created was protecting the company years after the original events. That institutional memory became increasingly valuable as the company grew. We expanded into new markets, took on new types of clients, offered new services. With each expansion, the complexity of our compliance obligations increased. But because we had strong systems and comprehensive documentation, we were able to scale our compliance program effectively. Other companies struggled with growth-related compliance problems. We didn't, because we had built solid foundations. Thomas Whitmore announced his retirement 5 years after the SEC crisis that had transformed the company. The board of directors conducted a search for his replacement, ultimately hiring a woman named Catherine Moreno who had been CFO of a larger financial services firm. During Catherine's first week, she asked to meet with each member of the executive team individually. When I sat down in her office, she got straight to the point. "I've reviewed Meridian's regulatory history," she began. "The turnaround in compliance performance over the past 5 years is remarkable. I understand you were central to that transformation." "I was part of a team effort," I said, not wanting to take sole credit. "Thomas gave me the authority and resources to build a proper program, and I hired excellent people to implement it." "I also understand you were exiled to a basement office before being promoted to CCO," Catherine said, catching me off guard with her directness. "That's an unusual career trajectory." "It was a difficult period," I acknowledged. "But it gave me a unique perspective on the company's operations and the problems that needed to be addressed." Catherine nodded. "Elena, I want you to know that you have my complete support as CCO. Compliance will remain independent and well-resourced under my leadership. I've seen too many companies destroy value through compliance failures. I'd rather lose revenue by being too conservative than lose the company by being too aggressive." That conversation set the tone for my relationship with Catherine. She proved to be even more supportive of compliance than Thomas had been. She had seen firsthand, in her previous roles, how devastating regulatory problems could be. She understood that my role wasn't to obstruct business, but to protect it from itself. Under Catherine's leadership, Meridian continued to grow. We expanded internationally, which brought new regulatory challenges. We developed new products, which required new compliance frameworks. We acquired smaller firms, which meant integrating their compliance practices into our systems. Through all of it, my team remained the central control point, ensuring that growth didn't compromise our standards. Now, 8 years after my exile to the basement, I sit in my executive office and reflect on the journey. My title is still Chief Compliance Officer, but my influence extends far beyond traditional compliance functions. I'm involved in strategic planning, in M&A decisions, in risk management across the entire enterprise. When the board of directors considers major initiatives, I'm in the room providing input. When external parties evaluate Meridian, our compliance program is seen as a competitive strength, not a cost center. And every significant document, every important transaction, every material decision still requires my signature. I am the gatekeeper, not through politics or manipulation, but through demonstrated competence and unwavering integrity. People seek my approval not because they fear me, but because they know that my approval means their work has met the highest standards, that it's defensible, that it's right. The people who laughed when I was transferred to the basement are mostly gone now. Brad is in prison. Gerald retired in disgrace. Others left during the cultural transformation, unable or unwilling to adapt to higher standards. New people have joined who never knew the old culture, who only know Meridian as a place where compliance is respected and integrity matters. But I haven't forgotten. I keep a photo on my desk that a colleague took of me working in the basement office. In it, I'm surrounded by file boxes, sitting at that small desk under fluorescent lights, looking tired but focused. It's not a flattering photo, and visitors sometimes ask why I display it prominently in my executive office. That's where I learned that your worth isn't determined by where you sit or what title you hold, I explain. It's determined by the quality of your work and the integrity of your choices. That basement office taught me more about leadership than any executive training program ever could. The photo reminds me to stay humble, to remember that circumstances can change quickly, that today's power can become tomorrow's vulnerability. It reminds me to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy, because you never know who will end up making critical decisions down the road. It reminds me that being underestimated can be an advantage if you use it wisely. Most importantly, it reminds me that the best revenge isn't personal vindication. It's building something better, creating systems that prevent others from experiencing what you went through, using your painful experiences to make positive changes that outlast any individual career. I sometimes wonder what my younger self would think if she could see where I ended up. That junior compliance analyst who joined Meridian 8 years ago with idealistic visions of protecting the company through careful adherence to regulations. Would she be surprised to find herself as Chief Compliance Officer, one of the most powerful people in the organization? Would she be proud of the choices I made along the way? I think she would be surprised by the path, certainly. The basement exile, the humiliation, the loneliness, none of that was in her career plan. But I think she would be proud of the response to those challenges. She would be proud that her older self didn't compromise principles under pressure, didn't cut corners to make things easier, didn't let difficult circumstances become an excuse for mediocrity. That younger Elena believed that doing good work mattered. The version of me sitting in this executive office has proven that belief correct, even though the path to validation was far more circuitous and painful than anyone could have anticipated. I've been approached by recruiters several times over the past few years, offering CCO positions at larger firms with higher salaries and more prestigious brands. I've turned them all down. Not because I'm afraid of change or because I lack ambition, but because I'm not finished building what I started at Meridian. The compliance program we've created is strong, but it needs to be sustainable beyond my tenure. I need to develop the next generation of leaders who will carry forward these principles after I eventually move on. I'm also not finished repaying the debt I feel to the company. Yes, they exiled me to a basement. Yes, they humiliated me. But they also eventually recognized their mistake and gave me unprecedented authority to fix what was broken. Thomas and the board could have brought in an outside CCO, someone without the baggage of the Brad Cunningham situation. Instead, they took a chance on me. I want to prove that their faith was justified. Besides, there's something deeply satisfying about succeeding in the place where you were written off. If I had left after my basement exile, Brad and Gerald would have won. They would have successfully pushed out the person who threatened their schemes. By staying, by building, by succeeding, I proved that they were wrong about me. That matters more than any external opportunity. My team has grown to 15 people now. Each one was carefully selected not just for their technical competence, but for their integrity and judgment. I've tried to create the kind of environment I wished I had worked in under Gerald. One where people feel safe raising concerns, where disagreement is welcomed, where doing the right thing is rewarded rather than punished. Several of my team members have told me that working in Meridian's compliance department has restored their faith in the profession. They had previous experiences where compliance was just window dressing, where their concerns were ignored, where they felt like their role was to provide paper-thin justifications for decisions that had already been made. Here, they say, compliance actually matters. Their work has real impact. They're not just checking boxes. They're genuinely protecting the company and its clients. That's the culture I wanted to build, and hearing that it's working validates all the difficult decisions, all the pushback from business units, all the times I had to say no when saying yes would have been easier. Culture isn't built through policies and procedures alone. It's built through consistent demonstration of values, through backing up your team when they do the right thing, through treating your role as a sacred trust rather than a political position. Last month, I was invited to join Meridian's board of directors. It's unusual for an active executive to serve on their own company's board, but Catherine proposed it as a way to formalize compliance's role in governance. The board agreed, recognizing that having a compliance perspective in board deliberations would strengthen their oversight. When the announcement was made, I thought about the journey that had led to this moment. From junior analyst to senior analyst to documentation specialist in a basement to chief compliance officer to board member. It was a path that no career counselor would have mapped out, full of setbacks and detours and moments that looked like failures but turned out to be setups for something better. If there's a lesson in my story, it's this: your current circumstances don't define your future trajectory. A setback is only permanent if you let it be. When you're pushed down, you can either stay down or use the experience to build strength, knowledge, and resilience that ultimately make you more capable than you were before. My basement exile was meant to diminish me. Instead, it taught me to see patterns others missed, to build systems that created lasting value, to develop the patience and perspective that effective leadership requires. The people who exiled me thought they were solving their problem by removing an obstacle. They didn't realize they were creating their own downfall by giving me the time and access I needed to understand what they were doing. Every file that moves through Meridian now passes through systems I designed. Every approval requires processes I implemented. Every significant decision requires my signature. Not because I'm clinging to power, but because the company learned, through painful experience, that strong compliance controls prevent far more problems than they create. The woman they sent to the basement, the one they laughed about, the one they dismissed as too rigid and too idealistic, turned out to be exactly what the company needed. My rigidity was actually integrity. My idealism was actually wisdom. My refusal to compromise on principles was actually strength. They thought they were burying me in that basement office. They were actually planting the seeds of their own replacement and my rise. Every hour I spent in that small room, organizing files and documenting patterns, I was building the case that would eventually transform the entire company. So when people ask me about my career journey, about how I became chief compliance officer and board member, I always mention the basement. Not because I'm bitter about it, but because it's an essential part of the story. The basement is where I learned that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you believe it. The basement is where I developed the skills that would eventually make me indispensable. The basement is where I proved that your value isn't determined by where you sit, but by what you do with the opportunities, even the terrible ones, that come your way. They laughed when I was transferred to the basement office. Nobody's laughing now. Every file passes through my signature, every decision requires my approval, every major initiative needs my input. And that's not because I schemed or manipulated my way to power. It's because I did excellent work when no one was watching, built systems when no one cared, and maintained my integrity when it would have been easier to compromise. That basement office, meant to be my grave, became my foundation. And on that foundation, I built something that has transformed an entire company's culture, protected countless clients, and created opportunities for others to do meaningful work with integrity. That's the real victory. Not personal vindication, though that's satisfying. Not power, though that's useful. The real victory is creating something that matters, building something that lasts, using your painful experiences to make the world a little bit better than you found it. My name is Elena Rodriguez. They laughed when I was transferred to the basement office. Now every file in this company passes through my signature, and nobody's laughing anymore. But more importantly, I learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the best thing that ever happened, if you have the courage and the wisdom to use it right. And that lesson, forged in a lonely basement office while people laughed at my downfall, is worth more than any title or any office with a view could ever be.